Welcome to Esoteric Guardian. For centuries, the image of a witch stirring a dark cauldron has haunted folklore, but behind the legend lies something far more unsettling. Ancient recipes mixed hallucinogenic plants, deadly poisons, and ritual magic into substances that could heal, kill, or open the door to visions no human mind was prepared to see. Tonight, we're uncovering the real history of those potions, their ingredients, the beliefs surrounding them, and the thin line between spiritual enlightenment and absolute destruction. Stay until the end, because some of these brews didn't just change the body. They shaped entire religions, cults, and myths that survive to this day. Long before we get to the infamous flying ointments, we need to understand how the image of the witch, astride a broomstick, vanishing into the night sky toward a distant mountain or forest clearing, actually came into being. It didn't appear fully formed in the medieval imagination. In fact, it took centuries for fragments of folklore, pagan ritual, heresy trials, and church propaganda to fuse into what scholars now call the elaborated theory of witchcraft. At its core, this theory claimed that a secret, woman-led sect had entered into a pact with the devil himself. These witches supposedly renounced Christianity, held nocturnal assemblies presided over by Satan, engaged in ritual orgies, sacrificed infants, and practiced magic meant to overthrow all of Christendom. By the mid-1400s, this narrative had grown apocalyptic. Inquisitors believed witches were soldiers in a final diabolical war against God, their gatherings swelling into vast synagogues of Satan, hidden in mountains or forests, attended by thousands. Confessions, often extracted under torture, described women flying great distances to attend these Sabbaths. Yet here is where things become complicated. Early church law, such as the Canon Episcopi written centuries earlier, had dismissed the idea of literal flight as mere delusion, phantasms imposed on the mind by demons, not physical journeys through the air. For a time, even the church believed these women traveled only in spirit, riding with pagan goddesses like Diana in visions, not reality. But as witch trials intensified through the 15th century, theologians reversed this position. They argued that Satan, master of the air since the days of Job, could carry witches bodily to these gatherings. Flight became essential to the myth. By the height of the witch hunts, thousands faced execution because inquisitors accepted as fact what had begun as folklore and fear, now transformed into theology and law. What made this belief so enduring was its merging with local pagan traditions. Pre-Christian Europe teemed with stories of nocturnal processions, spirit flights, and women riding with the dead through winter skies. As these tales filtered into trial records, they were recast as evidence of a diabolical conspiracy. And here, for the first time, we start seeing mentions of potions and ointments, substances said to give witches the power to fly, to fall into trances, to leave their bodies behind. These recipes, real or imagined, would soon play a central role in both the mythology of witchcraft and the accusations that sent thousands to their deaths. But what the witches really were? Many of the women later called witches were likely healers, midwives, or solitary herbalists pushed to the edges of society. They carried knowledge passed down for centuries, how to treat fevers, ease childbirth, or calm a sick child when no doctor would come. In villages where medicine and magic blurred together, these women held power that both saved lives and inspired fear. Because they understood plants in ways few others did. They knew which leaves brought sleep, which roots could silence pain, and which seeds carried visions mistaken for divine revelations. But they also knew something darker: how to kill with precision. A single plant could cure in one dose and destroy in another. To the church, this knowledge felt inhuman. Healing might be tolerated, but poisons that killed without blade or fire seemed like sorcery. When inquisitors heard about ointments, brews, or powders, they imagined pacts with the devil rather than centuries of folk medicine. And in an age of plague, famine, and superstition, that misunderstanding would send tens of thousands to the stake. Now let's talk about some of the most feared poisons and hallucinogens in witchcraft and folklore. Among the most feared and misunderstood of all witchcraft potions was the flying ointment. Emerging from medieval Europe, it appeared repeatedly in trial records and inquisitorial confessions. The mixture promised a sensation of weightlessness, visions of distant Sabbaths, and in many accounts, the feeling of leaving one's own body to travel across the night sky. Its ingredients read like a catalogue of poisonous plants: belladonna, henbane, mandrake, and datura. All contain tropane alkaloids such as atropine and scopolamine, chemicals that even in small doses can induce delirium, hallucinations, and a total break from reality. Those who use the ointment often described vivid scenes of demons, banquets, and orgiastic rituals in remote mountains or forests, images that perfectly matched the church's worst nightmares. What unsettled inquisitors even more was how the ointment was applied. To bypass the stomach and to make the poison work faster, it was sometimes rubbed on thin, sensitive skin or even mucous membranes. Later centuries would twist this detail into the legend of witches riding broomsticks coated with the ointment, straddling them so the toxins would absorb more efficiently. The myth of flying witches was born not from open skies, but from chemistry and hallucination, filtered through fear, torture, and superstition. By the 17th century, Europe feared witches' ointments and hallucinogenic brews, but Aqua Tofana was something far more precise. Created in Italy and attributed to Giulia Tofana, it was not a potion for visions or rituals. It was death in liquid form, engineered for subtlety. The mixture combined arsenic, water, and traces of lead and belladonna into a clear, tasteless solution. That combination made it perfect for poisoning. No bitterness in the wine, no color in the soup, nothing to give away its presence until it was far too late. Death arrived slowly, over several doses, with symptoms resembling natural illness: fatigue, stomach pain, dehydration, so doctors rarely suspected foul play. Even modern toxicology admits that 17th century medicine had no way of detecting it. Giulia Tofana allegedly distributed the poison in tiny vials, disguised as cosmetics or holy water, sometimes marked with the image of St. Nicholas to avoid suspicion. Legend claims she operated through a network of widows and apothecaries in Naples, Rome, and Palermo. So many women supposedly used it against abusive husbands that authorities later called them La Lega del Vedove, the Association of Widows. The numbers remain uncertain, but some accounts claim Aqua Tofana killed over 600 men before Giulia herself was arrested and executed in Rome around 1659. By then, the poison had taken on a mythical status. Priests warned parishioners about it from the pulpit, travelers feared it in roadside inns, and rulers whispered about it in their courts. The terror came not only from the deaths themselves, but from the idea that power had shifted. Aqua Tofana put lethal force into the hands of women in a patriarchal society, allowing them to kill without sword, gun, or open rebellion. That combination of poison, secrecy, and gender made it one of the most feared substances in European history. Few plants inspired as much fear in the ancient world as aconitum, known to the Greeks as the helmet of Jupiter and to the Celts as the plant of the wolf. Its reputation spread from the Mediterranean to the forests of northern Europe, leaving a trail of myth, warfare, and witchcraft accusations along the way. The poison works quickly. Alkaloids in the root attack the nervous system, first numbing the mouth and throat, then slowing the heart until breathing stops entirely. Victims remained conscious as paralysis crept through their bodies, a death as silent as it was terrifying. Ancient texts describe it coating arrowheads, hunting spears, even water supplies during sieges. Celtic tribes smeared it on traps meant for wolves and bears. Greek assassins used it to settle political disputes without open violence. In mythology, aconitum carried a sinister origin. The Greeks claimed it first sprang from the foam of Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades, when Hercules dragged the beast out of the underworld. That connection to death and the afterlife only deepened its aura of evil. By the Middle Ages, when herbalists and so-called witches kept small quantities for hunting or medicine, inquisitors saw it as proof of satanic allegiance. To church authorities, anyone who possessed a plant capable of killing so efficiently had to be in league with the devil himself. Among all the poisons feared in medieval Europe, few carried a reputation as contradictory as Cantarida, the so-called Spanish fly. Unlike hemlock or aconite, this toxin didn't come from a plant, but from the litter Vesicatoria beetle. When crushed, the insect releases cantharidin, a compound so corrosive it burns anything it touches: skin, throat, stomach, even the kidneys, filtering it from the blood. A small dose caused fever, vomiting, and blisters throughout the digestive tract. Larger amounts brought internal bleeding, kidney failure, and death in agony. Yet despite its danger, Cantarida gained a second, infamous life as an aphrodisiac. Medieval texts whisper about men slipping powdered beetle into wine, convinced its painful irritation of the urinary tract meant heightened passion rather than approaching organ failure. This double reputation, part love potion, part lethal poison, made Cantarida both feared and desired. Physicians warned of its toxicity, while apothecaries sold it in secret. By the Renaissance, its name appeared in trial records alongside accusations of witchcraft, poisonings, and illicit seductions, each story adding to the myth of a substance that promised pleasure, but more often delivered a slow, excruciating death. Hemlock was never just another plant. In classical Greece, it became the state's weapon of choice, a cold, bureaucratic executioner in the form of a simple cup. No blades, no spectacle, just a bitter infusion handed to those condemned by the courts of Athens. Its power came from alkaloids like coniine, which attacked the nervous system in a very particular way. First, the muscles weaken, then the body grows numb, and finally, the lungs stop moving altogether. The terrifying part? The mind stays clear as the body shuts down, leaving the victim aware as the paralysis spreads. The death of Socrates in 399 BCE burned this image into history. Accounts describe him drinking the potion calmly, speaking to his students as the numbness climbed his body, then lying down once his legs no longer obeyed him. He met the end with reason rather than panic, and for centuries that scene turned hemlock into a symbol not only of death, but of philosophy itself. Outside the courts, though, the plant had other reputations. Hunters used it on arrows for wolves and wild dogs. Assassins preferred it because it left no wounds, no noise, only a lifeless body hours later. Medieval herbalists kept it in tiny doses for pain relief, but inquisitors saw something else entirely. A plant that could kill without leaving marks fit too neatly into their vision of witches serving the devil. By the time witch trials swept Europe, hemlock was no longer just the poison of Socrates. It was part of the growing catalogue of witches' plants, deadly, secretive, and always waiting in the shadows between medicine and murder. Medieval Europe lived in fear of poisoned cups. Wine and ale were everywhere, at banquets, monasteries, royal courts, and that made them perfect hiding places for toxins. Arsenic, mercury, even lead salts dissolved easily into these drinks, turning hospitality itself into a potential weapon. Chroniclers tell of nobles collapsing mid-feast, bishops wasting away days after dining with rivals, entire families struck down after weddings or political councils. Few suspected poison at first. Illnesses were common, medicine was primitive, and symptoms like vomiting or fever could be blamed on plague or spoiled food. That ambiguity gave poisoners cover and terrified everyone else. Assassinations weren't the only fear. In villages, rumors spread that witches laced pitchers of ale with curses, killing livestock, or spreading sickness through entire households. To inquisitors, a jug of wine found near a dying man became evidence of sorcery as much as murder. By the late Middle Ages, antidote manuals circulated among the wealthy, listing ways to test wine with bread, silver, or gemstones, none of which worked reliably. The truth was simpler and far more frightening. A single drink could carry enough arsenic to kill silently, and no one at the table would taste a thing. The tall purple flowers of Digitalis purpurea, or foxglove, grew across Western Europe, striking but dangerous. Inside its leaves hid chemicals that could twist the heart's rhythm, slowing it, speeding it, or stopping it altogether. Some healers learned that in tiny amounts, foxglove eased certain heart conditions. These women, often midwives or folk doctors, measured doses by instinct and tradition, not by scales or chemistry. A fraction too much turned medicine into murder. Stories spread quickly. A nobleman dead after a single draught, a patient recovering one day and buried the next. To villagers and inquisitors, there was no difference between a healer who failed and a witch who cursed. Both worked with plants that carried life and death in the same cup. By the time witch trials consumed Europe, foxglove joined the catalogue of suspicious herbs. A plant that could stop a heart without leaving a wound or trace felt like the devil's work, no matter how many lives it might have saved in careful hands. Medieval trial records mention it again and again. The infamous flying ointment witches supposedly used before their nocturnal sabbaths. Recipes varied, but most included belladonna, henbane, mandrake, and datura, plants loaded with alkaloids like atropine and scopolamine, compounds that blur the line between dream and reality. Applied to the skin, or as whispered in the more lurid accounts, to mucous membranes, the ointment induced delirium, vivid hallucinations, and the terrifying sensation of the soul leaving the body. Those under its influence described rushing through the air, meeting demons, or attending distant gatherings under the devil's gaze. Whether these visions came from the plant's chemistry or from superstition hardly mattered. To inquisitors, they were proof that witches truly flew through the night. The broomstick legend grew from here. Some scholars suggest that using the ointment on a staff or riding object allowed the poison to absorb more effectively, while artists and preachers turned that detail into the enduring image of witches silhouetted against the moon. Long before Europe's witch trials, shamans in Siberia and northern Europe brewed potions from the red and white Amanita muscaria mushroom. In controlled rituals, it brought euphoria, distorted sense of time, and the uncanny feeling of leaving one's body, visions interpreted as spiritual journeys or meetings with the dead. But the mushroom's power carried real danger. Its active compounds, muscimol and ibotenic acid, could just as easily cause nausea, violent convulsions, or coma if the dose ran too high. Some shamans even recycled its effects by drinking the urine of those who had taken it first, since the hallucinogenic chemicals survived the body's metabolism. As tales of these rituals spread, medieval Europe folded them into its growing fear of witches and poisons. What had once been sacred shamanic practice became, in the minds of inquisitors, yet another sign of diabolical pacts and nocturnal flights. When medieval herbalists listed Hyoscyamus niger, or henbane, they wrote about it carefully. Every part of the plant carried danger: the leaves, the seeds, even its roots. All contained tropane alkaloids, hyoscyamine, scopolamine, and traces of atropine, the same chemical family later identified in belladonna and datura. These substances interfere with the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, disrupting the signals that regulate vision, memory, and muscle control. Healers use tiny amounts of henbane as an anesthetic for surgery or to quiet persistent pain. Sometimes it was mixed into beer or wine for what chroniclers called cervisia furiosa, the furious brew, because too much sent drinkers into delirium. Symptoms began with dizziness and blurred vision, followed by auditory hallucinations, a sense of floating, or the terrifying impression that one's body had changed size. Higher doses caused convulsions, amnesia, or coma. Many never woke up. By the late Middle Ages, trial records accused witches of using henbane in flying ointments. Whether that was real practice or inquisitorial invention is hard to know. The plant undeniably produced visions so vivid that victims swore they had traveled miles, met spirits, or attended secret gatherings. For theologians hunting evidence of demonic pacts, henbane seemed like the devil's fingerprint on the human mind. Mandrake root, thick and split into limbs, looked disturbingly human when pulled from the soil. That shape fueled a mythology as potent as the plant's chemistry. Its main alkaloids, hyoscyamine, scopolamine, and mandragorine, acted as powerful anticholinergics, causing sedation, hallucinations, and in high doses, respiratory failure. Ancient physicians like Dioscorides prescribed mandrake wine as a surgical anesthetic. It could knock a patient unconscious before cauterization or amputation. Fertility rites in Greece and the Near East treated the root as an aphrodisiac, while medieval midwives used trace amounts to ease childbirth pains. But a slip in dosage meant nausea, delirium, or a coma so deep it looked like death itself. Legends grew fast around those dangers. Bestiaries claimed the mandrake's scream could kill a man. Instructions for safe harvests involved dogs, lunar phases, and protective charms. By the 15th century, grimoires described witches feeding mandrake roots with milk, wine, or honey before using them in potions to summon spirits or demons. Whether or not that happened, the combination of real toxicity, anesthesia, and hallucination made the plant seem halfway between medicine and sorcery. Perfect material for the witch trials to come. Among the plants tied to witchcraft, few inspired more fear than datura. Its white, trumpet-shaped flowers looked innocent enough, but inside every seed, leaf, and root lived a cocktail of alkaloids: scopolamine, atropine, hyoscyamine, so unstable that the same dose could leave one person euphoric and another dead within hours. Healers in Asia had used it for centuries as an anesthetic, blowing its smoke into patients' faces before surgery. But when it reached medieval Europe, it slipped into an entirely different role. Folk healers mixed it into ointments with belladonna and henbane, thickening the blend with animal fat until it clung to the skin like wax. Those who used it spoke of leaving their bodies, of flying to distant Sabbaths, of seeing demons gathered around bonfires. And whether those visions came from the plant's chemistry or the interrogator's rack scarcely mattered. To inquisitors, such confessions proved the devil's hand was at work. The effects explain why. Datura doesn't bring gentle dreams. It tears the mind loose from reality. Victims staggered under fevers and vertigo, spoke with people who weren't there, fought invisible enemies, or wandered for days before collapsing, unable to tell vision from memory. Some woke with no recollection at all. Dose control bordered on impossible, so every ritual, every experiment risked pushing the user past hallucination into seizure, coma, or death. It became known as the plant that opened doors the soul might never close again. Belladonna carried the same poisons in a different disguise. Renaissance women dripped its juice into their eyes to dilate their pupils, believing the dark, glassy look made them beautiful, even as physicians warned that the same drops could stop the heart. Like Datura, it twisted the nervous system until heat, light, and movement blurred into chaos. Those accused of witchcraft admitted, sometimes willingly, sometimes under torture, to using belladonna in the infamous flying ointments, smearing it across their skin before describing journeys through the night sky to meet the devil himself. Whether any of it truly happened hardly mattered. The chemistry alone could deliver visions so coherent, so convincing, that users swore they had danced at Sabbaths miles away while their bodies lay trembling in darkened rooms. And because too much meant delirium, seizures, or a slow, paralyzed death, the plant blurred the line between medicine, magic, and murder, until no one could say where one ended and the other began. Growing silently on damp rye fields, ergot was not a plant, but a parasite, a fungus infecting grain, turning kernels dark and spurred with its toxic growths. When harvested unknowingly and ground into flour, it carried alkaloids like ergotamine and ergometrine, chemical cousins to what centuries later would be synthesized into LSD. Medieval outbreaks of St. Anthony's fire, as ergotism became known, left entire villages writhing in convulsions, skin burning as if aflame, limbs blackening with gangrene from constricted blood vessels. Survivors told of terrifying visions, demons clawing at their beds, witches flying through the night, voices whispering blasphemies from the rafters. Some raved for days before dying, others lost fingers, toes, or whole limbs as circulation shut down. Historians argue that these mass poisonings blurred into folklore and panic, feeding Europe's witchcraft hysteria. When people claimed to see witches dancing on rooftops or Satan himself stalking the countryside, the explanation might not have been diabolical at all, but a fungus woven into their daily bread. Centuries later, theories about the Salem witch trials suggested that a single infected harvest could have turned an isolated Puritan village into a theater of mass hallucination, fear, and death. By the late Middle Ages, all these substances, henbane, mandrake, datura, belladonna, even the rye fungus ergot, had drifted from the apothecary's shelf into the interrogator's imagination. The line between folk medicine and devilry collapsed. A midwife with herbs to ease childbirth a healer with ointments for pain relief, a farmer whose bread carried a tainted harvest. All could find themselves accused of consorting with Satan if visions, illness, or death followed in their wake. This growing fear needed rules, it needed doctrine, and in 1487, it got one. That year, two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, published a book that would become the handbook of Europe's witch hunts, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Written in a world already reeling from plague, famine, and religious upheaval, it claimed to expose how witches made pacts with the devil, brewed storms, spread disease, and poisoned whole communities with the very plants we've just explored. By the late 15th century, Europe was ready to burn. Plague, famine, religious schisms, and bread, poisoned with ergot, had created a climate where any misfortune could be blamed on the devil. Stories of night flights, Sabbaths, and witches' ointments fueled the collective fear, but so far it lacked structure. It lacked a doctrine that could tie together rumor, hallucination, and clerical panic into a single apocalyptic narrative. That doctrine arrived in 1487, bound in calfskin, dripping with scripture and menace, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Its authors, the Dominican inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, didn't invent witch hunting, but they gave it its most lethal weapon, a manual carrying papal authority written in the language of theology and canon law, turning superstition into a legal and religious machine. It opened with the papal bull Summus Desiderans of 1484, in which Pope Innocent VIII not only affirmed the existence of a satanic conspiracy led by women, but also empowered inquisitors to eradicate it by any means necessary. Then came the body of the Malleus, divided into 3 parts, each written in the scholastic Quaestio Disputata style. Raise a question, present false objections, then refute them with scripture, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and finally the author's own conclusions, all presented as inevitable truth. Beneath the academic veneer, the text functioned like a self-contained engine of accusations. The first part laid out what scholars now call the elaborated theory of witchcraft. A pact with the devil, sexual relations with demons, nocturnal flights to distant Sabbaths, infanticide and ritual cannibalism, storms raised over farmland, cattle disease, blighted harvests, miscarriages, sterilized couples, and a female-led conspiracy undermining Christianity in Satan's final offensive before the apocalypse. Anyone denying the reality of this conspiracy, the authors argued, was doing the devil's work by refusing to fight it. Disbelief itself became heresy. The second part catalogued what witches supposedly did: blighting crops, killing infants, raising hailstorms, causing impotence, or the infamous vanishing member curse, summoning demons, sending plagues, even making people believe they had been turned into animals. Here is where the hallucinogenic ointments entered indirectly. The Malleus insisted that no charm, herb, or potion had power on its own. Demons performed the real work. That meant the delirium caused by belladonna, henbane, mandrake, or datura, the sensations of flight, the banquets, the Sabbaths described by trembling defendants under torture, were not chemical accidents. They were Satan's signature, proof of a pact with hell. The third part was the most lethal. It described in procedural detail how to investigate, interrogate, and execute accused witches. Under the inquisitorial system, a single figure gathered evidence, judged its sufficiency, and pronounced the verdict. Torture was not an exception. It was the core method for producing truth. The Malleus even warned that witches could resist pain through diabolical magic, So if the accused didn't scream, inquisitors were told to intensify the torture. And if she did scream, she might be faking. Either way, the outcome was the same. Confessions, ripped from bodies on the strappado, hands tied behind the back, the victim hoisted until shoulders dislocated, sometimes with weights tied to the feet, became evidence. The church, hypocritically, claimed it did not execute anyone. It merely relaxed the condemned to secular authorities who burned them alive in the public square. The Malleus also dripped with misogyny. Women, it argued, were weaker in faith, morally unstable, and sexually voracious, making them ideal recruits for the devil. The authors even plus cited a false etymology. Femina came from fides and minus, less faith. Under this logic, any midwife, healer, or widow with knowledge of herbs or childbirth could be accused of conspiring with Satan. And once accused, the path ended almost inevitably in fire. The printing press did the rest. Between 1487 and 1523, at least 14 editions circulated across the Holy Roman Empire. After a lull during the Reformation, a second wave from the 1570s through the 1660s carried it through the peak of Europe's witch trials. 28 editions in total spread the Malleus across Germany, France, Italy, England, and even the New World, used by both Catholics and Protestants. In later printings, it was bound together with exorcism manuals and demonological treatises, forming a kind of portable apocalypse in leather covers. Modern historians now recognize the Malleus Maleficarum for what it was: a conspiracy theory in the language of canon law, a book that turned rumor, misogyny, and hallucination into procedures for mass murder. Between 40 and 60,000 people, mostly women, were executed during the witch-hunting era it helped codify and legitimize. A single book gave Europe a cosmic enemy, then taught it how to burn that enemy alive. And for 2 centuries, it worked. When you trace the story from the first whispered legends of witches riding through the night sky to the tortured confessions of women accused of flying to Satan's Sabbath, you realize none of this began with monsters or demons. It began with ordinary fears of sickness, of famine, of a world spinning out of control, and with people desperate for an explanation. The herbs, the poisons, the hallucinations, they gave shape to the panic. The Malleus Maleficarum gave it rules, procedures, and scripture. And together, they turned Europe into a stage where faith, fear, and death marched hand in hand for centuries. The real horror isn't the broomsticks or the Sabbaths or the pacts with the devil. It's how quickly a society can convince itself that it kills in the name of order, of reason, of God. How neighbors can become executioners, how knowledge can be twisted into evidence of guilt, how law itself can kneel before hysteria. That's the legacy left behind by the flying ointments, the poisoners, and the hammer of witches. A legacy of smoke rising over towns that thought they were purging evil and never realized until it was too late that the fire had already consumed them from within.